Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Transcend and the Mid-Atlantic ADA Centers, the human experience of Black people with disabilities and their rights under the ADA. This is our second webinar, Unpacking Discrimination, Stigma, and Multiple Marginalization.
And good afternoon. Welcome to our ADA webinar series, The Human Experience of Black People with Disabilities and Their Rights under the ADA. This is a quarterly webinar series intended to unpack the opportunities as well as the challenges and barriers faced by Black individuals with disabilities in accessing information and exercising their rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA. Today's session is focused on the unpacking discrimination, stigma, and multiple marginalization. My name is Johnny Bailey. I am a community leader and also the founder of Bailey Media Group and an education consultant for the ADA. My broader mission at work is to close the racial wealth gap, and I believe that technology, entrepreneurship, and financial wellness are the vehicles that will help us accelerate the Black economy. Here with me today, I have my colleagues, Ms. Anne Deschamps and Banu Priya Motoru, who have been instrumental in developing and facilitating this research study. I'll start with you, Anne. Please give us a better introduction of yourself, all the amazing things that you have done in your career, and also here with the ADA in directing this study. Then we'll move over to Banu, and then we'll wrap it up with our special guest speaker, Anne.
Thank you so much, Johnny. On behalf of Transcend and the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, I'm so excited to welcome everybody today and for this great conversation about the intersection of race and disability. We've worked very hard over the past 3 years conducting research, examining this critical topic. And I'm really excited to finally get the results of the research out into the public so we can have further discussions and decide what the next steps are moving forward. So I'm going to turn off my camera now because I look forward to hearing the discussions, and I'm thrilled to have Imani Barbarin on today. I just want to say that. I know I'm taking away the big surprise, Johnny, but I'll turn it back to you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Awesome. Banu.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Banu Priya Moturu, and I'm an assistant professor at New Mexico State University. My research focuses on workplace disparities at the intersection of race, gender, culture, and disability, and I'm thrilled to be part of this important discussion today. I'm a South Asian woman with long dark hair, and today I'm wearing a white blouse. I'm smiling and excited to be here.
Fantastic. So, Anne let the cat out of the bag, but we are honored and excited to have a distinguished disability rights and inclusion activist who uses her social media platforms to drive conversations regarding disability empowerment for her community. She is the founder of Crutches and Spice and a true force in the industry. We want to welcome Ms. Imani Barbarin to our webinar today. Imani.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me. Again, my name is Imani Barbarin. I'm an African-American woman with shoulder-length dreadlocks. I'm wearing a denim dress and I am smiling at the camera. I'm so happy to be here and I thank you so much for inviting me.
Awesome. So, as we dive into this, the agenda for today, this session will be co-moderated by Banu and myself, with Imani as our subject matter expert. We plan to cover the following topics. We'll have knowing your rights under the ADA to really set the stage, and then we'll move into defining intersectionality, disability resources and supports, and we'll conclude with activating your advocacy. And we'll alternate so you all have some varying questions and perspectives from Banu and myself. And of course, Imani will add the color to the entire presentation. So to kick things off and set the table, Banu, what do people need to know about the research study and their rights under the ADA?
Thank you, Johnny. So in our recent study, we used an intersectionality framework and a qualitative approach to explore the lived experiences of Black individuals with disabilities. Our focus was on how participants understood their rights under the ADA, how they accessed information, the barriers they encountered in asserting their rights, and the strategies they used to navigate these systems. We conducted 4 focus groups with a total of 50 participants. Through thematic analysis, we identified 7 key themes that shed light on their experiences. Understanding and knowing their rights under the ADA was our first theme. Many participants spoke about their awareness or lack thereof of the rights and the protections they are entitled to. Participants also described where and how they learned about their rights and what resources were most accessible to them. Participants also identified and highlighted internal and external challenges around identity, inclusion, and acceptance. Another key theme we found was inadequate disability and resources. Many shared frustrations about the limited accessibility of services and accommodations. Discrimination and marginalization was also emerged as a major theme. Despite all of the challenges they mentioned, we also found that continuing advocacy was something that most participants engaged in. So stories of self-advocacy and collective efforts to fight for rights and inclusion were discussed. In this context, participants also shared about receiving supports and accommodations. Overall, the study underscores how structural racism and ableism compounded the struggles faced by Black individuals with disabilities and how critical it is to uplift their voices and lived experiences in conversations about disability rights. With that context in mind, we are excited to deepen this conversation today through a dialogue. So we are honored to be joined by disability rights advocate Imani Barbaran, whose insights resonate powerfully with the themes from our study. So to begin the conversation, I'll now hand it over to Johnny to kick off with our first question.
Wonderful. Well, now, Imani, I would like you to set the table for us. In a world of discrimination and marginalization, plain and simple, how do you define intersectionality?
Um, Kind of the elevator pitch that I like to use for intersectionality is understanding the systemic barriers that come along with somebody's identity and understanding kind of how they stack upon one another, right? As a Black disabled woman, I experience disability and this our society much different than you as a Black person, a Black man, right? And so when we understand the ways in which we are dealing with the systemic barriers that are created for our identities, we can kind of start to unpack them and make sure that we are creating a societal that is equitable for all.
Mm, mm. Yeah. And you and I had a conversation about the historical context
Yeah.
of disability and the lack of research that exists. And maybe we'll touch on that a little bit further on. But you've spoken extensively about the concept of intersectionality in your work. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how like the compounding of different identities uniquely shapes an individual's experience in America?
I think, well, in America, we have this issue where we experience our oppressions kind of like breathing, right? And so to parse out which aspect of our lives, the difficulties that we experience are whether from race or disability or gender is very difficult to do. And when we attempt to, um, it could be kind of seen as complaining or kind of using race card, gender card, disability card. But in reality, these systems are stacked like a deck of cards.
Mm,
Right. And I think that once we start to pull at one or two, the entire thing is going to come collapsing down. And particularly when it comes to disability, there's a reason why I talk about disability first. And it's because quite often, every marginalization that we experience in society leads to disability in some way. That is kind of the trajectory that we all experience if we are not straight, white, able-bodied men, quite often. And so when we start to unpack this house of cards that is built around us, almost like a cage, we can start to actually begin the work of creating societies that are accessible, inclusive for everybody that wants to participate in this society.
Imani, research on Black individuals with disabilities remains limited.
Mhm.
In your view, why is there such a scarcity of research in this area? And what historical or systemic factors do you think contribute to this gap?
Well, there's several factors. I wouldn't say 100% that there is no research on Black and disability communities, but what I will say is that historically, when we look at the research that has been done on our past as Black people, as people who are oftentimes descendants of enslavement, it is very rare that you see disability talked about in very stark terms, right? There's a lot of euphemisms, there's a lot of coded language around disability. And so when we think about what disability is in our current era, a lot of that language would not be applied 200, 300 years ago. And so it's kind of difficult to parse out. Another aspect to this is that when we think about intersectionality, when we think about marginalization, disability and race have always been used in tandem for oppression. Eugenics and disability and race have always been used to coincide with one another. And so we often, at least for me, I often observe that the way that we talk about disability currently is designed to erase disability from Black narratives. And so we oftentimes herald or celebrate Black leaders like Harriet Tubman, Fannie Lou Hamer, even Halle Berry, as kind of these accomplishments that are outdoing the implication that Blackness and disability are related. And because when we look at the language used to enslave, used to oppress, if we actually pay attention to what it is, it sounds like they are trying to associate disability and race inherently with one another. And so we have done the work in a small way or large way of doing the work for white supremacy, of erasing the Black disability narratives, of erasing disability in Black stories, despite the fact and the knowledge that disability disproportionately impacts Black people. We know that 25% of Black people have a disability according to the CDC, and those are all self-reported numbers. So it's probably much higher when we think about the factors of rental discrimination, when we think of people who are stuck in food deserts or are without resources, all of these factors lead to further disability.
In some way, it's so powerful, right? Like how you said disability is erased in some way, and it is how some of the discrimination is perpetuated as well. How have you seen ableism show up in disability-related research?
Ableism or racism in disability research or
Or
ableism?
ableism show up in terms of whether it is in design methodology or whose voices are centered or excluded?
Well, I think that when we look at how research is performed, it's generally speaking from the perspective of non-disabled people trying to better understand the disability community. Very rarely are we giving disabled people, let alone disabled Black people, the finances, the resources, and the platforms to perform research that is integral to their communities. We also don't take in, we don't often take into perspective that their own experiences are, in fact, guiding them to do such research. And so we very rarely give particularly Black disabled people the opportunity to integrate within their own communities, have these conversations with their own communities. And I think this all stems from this idea, just a fundamental idea around ableism, which is that disabled people cannot be authorities over our own lives, over our own stories, over our own narratives, when in reality, we are the experts of our own lives. And again, when it comes to race, you're doubling that. And so I wanted to also add for the last question you asked, quite often disability is seen as yet another marginalization that Black people cannot afford to have. So we are oftentimes taught to hide it, to not celebrate that aspect to ourselves, um, because it is so inherently tied to Blackness when we think about the history of racism in this country. So yeah, those are all kind of the ideas surrounding around this limitation of research.
I like the historical context you added because I am a history nerd, particularly Black history nerd. I feel like as a, if you're an activist or you're a community leader, you really need to understand the history of America and particularly Black history and our place, and our contributions here in America. And you see a lot of things are cyclical. A lot of these things that happened in the past are still happening. Um, it's insidious, but sometimes it's in plain sight. Some of the marginalizations that we experience. So, really love your perspective, especially as a woman, Black woman who identifies as having a disability. It's just informative to me to hear your perspective as well.
Thank you.
Um, and I'm a Black man, and I have my privileges, and I also have still my discriminations in America that I have to overcome. And so this is really, really important conversation. But you've spoken in some of your spaces about how the real challenge isn't disability itself, but how people treat you because of it.
Mhm.
And I know many of our participants here have shared some of their struggles with belonging and inclusion because of their disability. Um, and I also see that you're using your social media channel and you've developed a voice. I too use social media to develop a personal brand and to contribute to the movement of advancing Black people. So I want to hear your take on this because you're doing it 10 times better than most people I know. How did you come to find your voice in a world, especially that often projects shame or imposes limitations on Black people, also people with disabilities? How have you cut through the noise and defined your identity and your voice online?
Well, well, I always make the joke that I started my blog, and I started talking online about my blog mostly because my mom was like, "I can't be the only one reading your blog." Um, but when it comes to shaping my identity, I've always kind of had like a strong sense of self, and I've also always kind of been the type of person that was loud and always talking. I was kicked out of a one-on-one piano class because I talked too much. It was just me and the teacher. She just couldn't put up with it anymore. But in terms of like creating my own identity, I think it's really difficult as somebody who's Black and disabled to be extremely, extremely upfront about our disability because a lot of times we're told to choose, right?
Mm,
Talk about Black things first or disability things first. But when it comes to when you actually understand and can kind of pull at the thread of disability, you realize it's attached to all of our marginalization. And in terms of creating an identity online and talking about those things, I felt like I didn't have a choice. I felt like there was so many things we were missing in
mm,
terms of the conversation around Blackness and disability, because there's a lot of disability spaces that are all white, and there's a lot of Black spaces that are devoid of disabled voices. And so I kind of wanted to bridge the gap in talking about how these things are, they're so commingled, they are the same thing in a lot of ways. And I kept being dogged and consistent and trying to make sure that people were listening to what I was saying, but also making sure I uplifted other Black disabled voices, make sure I platformed other Black disabled people because I don't want it to just be me. I don't want people
yeah.
to just look at me and say, "Oh, that's the voice of this group," when we are a very large and diverse group of people, even within the Black disability space. So that's kind of how I approached my online
Yeah.
advocacy.
At what point did you feel the sense of responsibility to lead this movement? And I look back on my life, and even as a kid, I always felt like I was meant for something important. And
Hmm.
I always had like what I felt like some responsibility of like figuring out what that was and figuring out how I would contribute to the world. And through reading and trial and error and failed endeavors, I started to develop an identity and kind of a purpose of what work I would do, what purpose I would die for.
Yeah.
And it's clear that you found that thing, like you're gonna live and die for this purpose. And I'm curious to know, like, when did you discover that? Like how did you really feel like this is the thing I'm going to champion?
Well, I will say I didn't look to lead anything. I just wanted to, make my voice heard. Because I really did want to do it in such a way where I wasn't just the only voice, but I also wanted to pass along opportunities to other people. But I think right around, I want to say after college and right before grad school, I decided I wanted to tell better disability stories that actually reflected what I experienced growing up.
Mm,
So much of it is just so much of it is just, inspiration, exploitation, and then, every story is about how a disabled person is sacrificing their lives to everybody. I didn't want to tell those stories. I wanted to tell stories that were from our perspective for disabled people, for Black disabled people. Um, and it kind of became like this compulsion where it made my life make sense. It made all of the unease and all of this almost rootlessness and feeling like I didn't really belong anywhere makes sense because it gave me a purpose to do those things. And it just kind of snowballed from there. Like I can't walk away from a conversation. I can't walk away when people are saying the wrong things about Black disabled people. I can't just say nothing. So, and that's kind of where it comes from. It more became like this is now part of me because I have to do it rather
yeah.
than like this aha moment where I was like, I can do this. It was more like, no, I have to do this.
Yeah. We call that a calling. Like it was calling you. You couldn't walk away from it. And I resonate. That's incredible. And kind of thinking about the storytelling of the blog and how you are, I do always, I feel like if you even look at history, it's like a white male is not going to tell the story of a black person, at least not correctly, and probably not as a hero, right?
Right.
And so I do feel largely the responsibility of us as any identity or community, we are primarily responsible for sharing our stories and telling shaping our own narrative for our community and our culture, right? Granted, it's allies and everyone needs to contribute and support equitably, but also we need to lead that charge because we're the subject matter experts on our community. And so we see media representation significantly influences public perception, and we can't always control that because we're not always the decision makers and directors of these media platforms.
Mhm.
But those perceptions about disabilities can be perpetually harmful. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I want to ask from your perspective, what are some of the most damaging tropes that you've observed in the media portrayals of intersecting marginalized identities, and what alternatives would you like to see?
Well, that's a loaded question because I could talk for days about that.
Give
Uh,
give us a little nugget because this is a good one.
I think one of the biggest media tropes is that like most disabled people are white people, particularly physical disabilities, right? When we talk about the inclusion of disabled people in Black media, generally speaking, we're not talking about like physical disabilities. We're talking about autism, mental health, and things like that. When it comes to physical disability portrayals of Black disabled people, it's in broader media. But most of those opportunities still go to white disabled people to tell the stories around disability. That's one of the main issues. Because even in the Black community, you've probably heard a lot of times like disability is kind of like a white thing to claim rather
Mhm.
than like just something that's part of our identity overall. Another trope is that it focuses on men a lot as well.
Mm,
I think that there's a lot of male directors in Hollywood that are obsessed with this idea. uh, Trying to be politically correct. This idea of like figuring out whether or not they're still attractive and can still bed somebody with a disability. And so a lot of those narratives go that way as well. But I think the town around the most damaging trope in media is that it is honorable for the disabled person to die as a sacrifice for everybody else, or to die at the onset of a disability because disability is worse than death. And generally speaking, we talk about things like Me Before You and several other films where they depict like this curmudgeon, angry person for having to be in a disability. And they kind of use disability as the entire backstory as to why they hate their lives, which, it doesn't go into the systemic issues or the treatment of somebody with a disability. It's a lot of oh, I'm disabled, this is my story. And then it also kind of ventures into a lot of villains in movies and TVs are disability coded. And they kind of they use the disability or the deformity quite often to be the backstory rather than creating full fleshed villains with a disability. A good example of like a good villain with a disability is the movie version of Wicked. And I think
Mm.
like Nessa Rose actually makes a lot of sense because they actually developed her to be a character and not just
Uh,
a trope of somebody with a disability.
I
So,
see.
yeah.
Good one. Good one. All right. Thank you for that. I'm going to pass it over to Banu.
We know that there are several gaps in accommodations and accessible resources. What are some stories or examples that have stood out to you in terms of resource inequity that need more public attention?
Well, there's several. There are certain places in the country um where disability resource centers in Black and Brown neighborhoods are underfunded, where resources are going more towards the white populations of disabled people rather than Black communities. I think a lot of the resource inequity also does not, I think a lot of disability circles do not know how to interact with Black disabled people or their families. If we are understanding that disability is yet another marginalization that they can ill afford where they are afraid to claim, then reaching out to get resources is very difficult for a lot of people within those communities. And I think that there's not a lot of cultural competency within certain disability centers or resource centers, simply because they're not really invested in making sure they know how to talk to these populations. And this is across the board. It's not just Black people. I think that there's other people of color who get the sense that disability is not something that they can engage in terms of resource gathering. Um, there are also issues where um, a lot of organizations have no idea where to even contact Black disabled people. Um, One example is I've told people go to churches, go to Black historically Black churches where you live, go to community centers and places like that, and you can repeat the same thing over and over and over again, and it never really hammers home that these are the places where a lot of times Black people organize. And there's also a disconnect too because there's so many Black people that are um, healthcare professionals, nurses, CNAs, doctors, whomever, and there's almost like this siloing of disability from medicine, which I find very odd. But a lot of those individuals can be tapped into just spreading information uh, to their own communities about how to get disability resources, how to access a social worker, and things like that.
Yeah, tapping into the existing resources and sharing and going into the community more and understanding how we can get the information out in the community context rather than in a siloed context of on a website or like not or an area where you don't see a lot of Black people
Right.
coordinate their yeah and or come together.
Yeah.
Uh, Do you see any examples that exist of what equitable resource distribution or any other community-based programs that exist that you think could be beneficial to replicate?
There have been several mask blocks. So there's a lot of groups that are working on distributing masks and PPE to different communities. They're basically self-funded. They make sure that they get out into communities at community events. Those are all good ideas. I think that the biggest thing is not to just relegate disability resources to disability spaces. Go to a cookout, go to a block party, go to like there are so many events during the summer, especially that are designed to make sure that, particularly people of color are enjoying themselves. Those are also places where we can organize and distribute resources. Um, like I said, churches, one of the best uh, groups of people or the one of the most equitable distribution of resources actually happened with the university. I don't know if you heard of James Madison University. One of the things that they did with all their students is hammer home to them, our resources are your resources. It's for everybody. It's not just for, um, if you've never had a diagnosis, we'll figure it out. If you need resources, we're going to figure it out. And so I think that that was kind of like the most widespread distribution research that I've ever seen, because they made it very apparent from the get-go that students, that members, that community members would be able to access accessibility and accommodations once they were at the university. How we would do this on a community-based level, again, we need to branch out outside of just disability spaces, because it's the places where people are having fun, where people are communing, where people are having dinner and eating and sharing a plate. That's where we can push a lot of these resources. And I think we kind of have pigeonholed ourselves into thinking disability that people are just going to come to disability spaces, whereas we need to branch out from disability spaces.
Yeah, and this is something we also see happening in terms of research also, and how siloed certain like journals are, like certain researchers, disability researchers published, and certain journals we don't see a lot of representation related to disability research, as like you mentioned, it is siloed to certain sections.
Right, right, exactly.
So I'll come back on here and try not to be too redundant around sources of information, but maybe kind of double clicking on the social media piece. And I think the beauty of social media is, I mean, it's kind of a gift and a curse, but the beauty of it can be that it's democratized information and it's giving people a voice,
Yeah.
and they can share information that's authentic and real to them. How do you envision the role of social media evolving in disseminating information about disability rights for the individuals?
Oof. I think that social media has kind of been a boon for disabled people, because we've been able to tell our own stories from our own voices, from our own phones. Where I see it going, though, is yet to be told. I'm very terrified of misinformation and disinformation with AI.
Yeah.
I'm very wary of that spreading in a way that is detrimental to the disability community. But as it pertains to how we can kind of utilize it going forward, I think creating creating conversations around specific topics used to be much easier. We have to figure out a way around kind of like this, I don't know how else to say it, but enshittification of social media. It makes it harder for us to carry on these conversations. I think having FaceTime with politicians and being able to talk about certain policy issues with one another is really where it's at. I think we have an untapped potential to look into the lives of millions of disabled people across the world, understand the issues on a molecular level, and develop policy and ideas around how to organize that we have never had before. And that's where we really need to look at things. I think we see social media as kind of a bullhorn, but it really is a focus group too. We need to start
Mhm.
looking into the conversations that are already happening, that people are already having, and actually start asking ourselves, how can we develop these conversations that are thought to be niche, that are thought to be just this specific group of disabled people, and branch it out into things that people are enthusiastic about, policy that people are enthusiastic about, research that people are excited to get involved in. Um, and I think that that's really where we see a potential that we have yet to tap into before. Because again, we only see communication on social media going one way, whereas we have an untapped amount of people, millions of people that we could be interfacing with, talking with, and literally listening to their ideas and saying to ourselves, how, if this is just one story, how many more stories are like this? And how can we turn this into something that is actionable for our future?
Mm, mm. And that's a perfect segue into my next question of thinking about what do you feel like the role of national disability organizations is? How should they play a part in reaching Black disabled communities more effectively?
Well, I think, again, a lot of these disability organizations, even from working for one, I think we're because of our funding, because of the ways in which we have to be creative with grants and federal law and things like that, disability is siloed amongst itself, right? We don't see disability as this far-reaching identity that impacts everybody, because it's not just disabled people. I think we get caught up in talking about disability along the lines of just disability, but disability impacts Black people, queer people, women, Indigenous people. Disability is kind of like, I always say that bigotry is the goal, but ableism and eugenics is the toolkit. And so
Mhm.
at every single turn, communities that are harmed are usually experiencing disability at much higher rates. And when we talk about disability organizations, they need to be at Pride. They need to be at, Juneteenth celebrations. They need to be at Black History celebrations. The infrastructure is already there. If we just create a pathway between us and all these communities that very clearly need disability advocacy or don't know to look to disability advocacy to better understand our own oppression and the systemic oppression that we face. So these organizations need to not just work along the lines of disability, but be everywhere where disabled people are. I think somebody's on the phone.
Somebody's,
Yeah, somebody asked me in the chat to repeat the last statement about eugenics.
yeah.
What I say is that bigotry is the goal, but eugenics and ableism is the toolkit. So bigotry is the goal, but eugenics and ableism is what turns them into action items.
Imani, you spoke about the impact of advocacy, the impact of coming together in spaces where people are gathering, not just for fun, beyond something where it's for advocating. If you could reimagine like what advocacy can look like and what advocating for others can look like in this fight, right? From your perspective, what are some of the community-led advocacy models that you think could work or could create or move towards real change?
Sure. So particularly when we're seeing the the destruction of our healthcare system, of our community healthcare system, whatever that looked like beforehand. I recommend everybody read a book called Black Disability Politics by Dr. Sammy Shock. And full disclosure, I read the audiobook, but that's my only role. All the credit for the work goes to Dr. Sammy Shock. But in her book, one of the solutions was something called the National Black Women's Health Conference. And what they did was they set up kind of like satellite groups in churches and hair salons and meeting places where Black people were all across the country to relay public health information to lay people, to people who would not otherwise have it. And I think that that is we see that model somewhat in like self-advocacy groups across the country. And I think we could kind of replicate it and bolster it in Black disability spaces to include conversations that are key to Black disabled people, and really all of us. And so I think that that's one of the best models that I've seen. It was small, it was community based. And I think that the more destruction um, that this government is going to bestow upon the United States, the more we need community-led efforts to gather health and disability information to making sure that we are talking about Blackness and disability at every turn and understanding how those marginalizations work together.
Yeah. Such kind of advocacy, sustained advocacy, community efforts, like requires deep commitment and energy. It
Mhm.
takes coming together in that way and continuing to sustain. Where or from whom do you draw inspiration to continue this work? And especially in the face of like ongoing resistance and injustice.
Well, I get a lot of my inspiration from other Black disabled people, both of the past and the present. Audre Lorde was the creator of self-care. That's where we get the idea of self-care from. And it was because she was a Black woman with a disability, right? She was somebody who was dealing with a recent cancer diagnosis and was trying to understand her new relationship with her body that had been disabled from cancer. And so that's kind of who I draw inspiration from, not the lush bubble baths and things like that, but more kind of like this need as Black disabled people to constantly reevaluate where we stand with our own bodies and minds, and therefore how we relate to the world in these identities. But a lot of it comes from other Black disabled people, other Black disabled content creators who have been doing the work for decades. Um, yeah, and I think that that's kind of where I gather a lot of my inspiration and get really excited to see them start conversations and dialogues around their own experiences and try to utilize that to advocate for us as a community.
And you mentioned the piece about your relationship with your body and mind, and you spoke a lot about rest and the context of being able to take care of oneself, to be able to give and show up. And it this
Yeah.
feels, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that we it's very difficult to show up in such a way, knowing that our bodies are used for labor constantly, that our bodies are constantly breaking down, and then we don't have the time to actually take care of them because we live in a society that will drain us to death if it could. And so it does require that we take care of ourselves, not in this hokey, must walk 30 minutes a day or run a mile every single, no, but more in a like, what are my boundaries for my body and my mind? What can I give? What versus what can I not give? And how do I decide how and when to rely on other people?
Mhm. I have one last question, Imani, before we open up for Q&A. What message or call to action would you offer to individuals and organizations seeking to better understand and actively work towards dismantling this intersectional, interlocking system of discrimination?
I think the biggest challenge that I try to get people to do is, and it sounds counterintuitive given the conversation that we're having, which is don't let disability get in the way of a good conversation. And what I mean by that is so often as disability advocates, as people who are in the disability space, we are preoccupied with making sure that somebody adopts the label of disability or make sure that they say the word disability, where if you look at the historical context with how disability has been weaponized against so many different communities, we also have to have the understanding that this may be a very terrifying ask to make of people, right? And so I always try to tell people, make sure your goal isn't getting somebody to shift their identity and their perception of themselves, but make sure that they're getting the resources first, right? Make sure that you're pointing them in the direction of the resources that they need first. The identity stuff can wait. And I think that there's so many people that are very gung-ho about making sure that we have the right labels, that we have the right terminology. But if you look back on history, Black people have been always doing disability advocacy, even without the vocabulary. They've always been doing health advocacy and health equity advocacy without using the vocabulary. And I think that it requires us to be a little bit more open-minded and understand the historical context as to why somebody is acting the way that they are when it comes to disability, why where that fear comes from, why and how it has been weaponized against them historically. And so that's kind of what I try to challenge people, say, making sure that you have a conversation with people, making sure you're building bridges, because if you can build trust first, that stuff will come next. We don't have to rush it right away. Just make sure that people are getting the resources they need first.
All right. I think we got some really good context out of Imani today. She dropped some incredible gems, and just sharing your personal experience has been really informative and enlightening. I'm hoping that the audience can take some calls to action. We dropped a few book recommendations and trailblazer names that we can do research on in the chat. So there should be something for everyone. And we got some really good context from the audience around how they define intersectionality. So I'm really glad that you all were able to participate in today's conversation. Before we go to Q&A, I want to run through a few resources that I feel will be beneficial to you all in the development of this research and this webinar series. One, I would like you all to complete the webinar survey. Let us know how we did today. Were the questions on point? How did you enjoy Imani's presence and insights today, and let us know how we can continue to improve this webinar series, as we do have two additional parts, part 3 and part 4, that are coming up later on this year. So we want to hear from you, and then we'll move on to the Q&A, and then we'll close out with a few resources that you all can utilize in your journey. So I'll stop here. Please go ahead and scan this QR code from your device, or you should be able to hard press it if you're on your mobile device, and it should open up a link. If you have limitations around the QR code, you could also type in the link in the chat. We just dropped the link there. You can hit that link directly. It will take you to a very quick 3-minute survey where you can provide feedback on today's session and insight or reviews on how we can improve these webinar series going forward. So I'll pause for 30 seconds to allow you all to do that. Again, this is Unpacking Discrimination, Stigma, and Multiple Marginalization, featuring the one and only Imani Barbarin.
Thank you. There is one question I was going to answer while people are filling it out.
Sure.
It says, I think it's from Julia. They're asking me about AI. Oh,
What's
here.
your thoughts on that?
I'll read it. What are your thoughts on using generative AI to improve accessibility while knowing it is incredibly harmful to the environment, poor POC neighborhoods, and creative spaces? I would have no problem with people using AI if it actually helps people. Like I think that AI is being built kind of as an accommodation for disabled people's creativity, but that makes no sense because accessibility is creativity put into action. So disabled people are well versed in how to put our creativity into work. And so it's kind of insulting, the idea that we need generative AI for accommodations. I could see if it was identifying cancers and using medical applications more often, but really it's just replacing people's ability to think. And people want to kind of use the disability community as a scapegoat rather than actually unpacking how harmful it is to multiple communities. Right now, outside of Memphis, they're turning the blackest part of Memphis into an AI farm that is going to pollute their environment and make it harder for people who live there to live there. So no, I don't see this as being helpful for disabled people. I don't see it being this sort of boon for disabled people. Um, I personally don't use it. I just think it's kind of using the disability community to do harm that they were already planning to do.
And that's a good segue. Hopefully everyone has scanned the QR and has a chance to hit the link. Let's move on to the Q&A session. So if you all have a question, we have about 6 minutes to go through maybe 5 questions, hopefully. Please drop your questions in the chat, and my team is also picking up some of these questions. So these may not all be directly on topic, but we're going to try to keep them all on theme. So here question here is, what are your thoughts on law enforcement and them increasing education to reduce negative interactions with Black disabled individuals in the community?
Well, has it done so? I mean, sorry, but like we keep filtering tons and tons of money to policing to reform itself to actually interact with disabled communities in better ways, but that has not led to any sort of increase, or excuse me, decrease in officer-involved shootings regarding disabled people. In fact, the highest amount of officer-involved shootings was last year, right? We keep plying them with more resources, plying them with more opportunities for understanding. To what end? To what end are we going to continue to do this? We need to actively put more money into community healthcare, into social workers, uh, more community social workers for different groups of people, um, making sure that people have mental health care in their communities and greater access to mental health care in their communities. Because even with expansion of mental health care services, it is still difficult to access. So if we're gonna talk about actual police, if we need to take our focus from police and make sure that we are investing in the communities, because I think it is ridiculous we keep giving billions upon billions of dollars to them only for the rate of incident and harm to increase. And we expect a different result every single time.
Good question, great answer. So another question I have here is, what is important to know about the intersection of living with a disability or discovering a disability with medical gaslighting for women, particularly for women of color?
I think and this is a perfect example of about how all marginalization leads to disability, right? I think that I don't think how do I put this? I think by the time it becomes a disability, you've been ignored for a very long time, right? I think that when we talk about the ways in which women are ignored, women of color are ignored, Black women are ignored in medical settings, we think about it as more of like life versus death, not life, death, and disability. And so by the time you are finally at the point where you are getting a diagnosis, where you are actively experiencing a disability and come to terms with a disability, it oftentimes has to do with people ignoring you up until that point. Um, and so there's going to be this large mistrust of the medical system, this kind of very a lot of anger regarding the medical system, but also a reluctance to get more resources because it means interact with more and more people who can ignore you or lie to you or deny you what you need. So that's kind of where I stand on that.
One of the next questions, Imani, you have is, as someone who works with transitioning youth, a significant challenge I face is addressing shame and internalized ableism, especially in BIPOC students' homes and special education professionals. What are some concepts that work with young adults to improve their self-esteem?
One of the best things that I did for myself when I was around that same age was actually learn about disability history. I think that we the idea around shame around disability comes from this idea, at least for me, that all of these experiences that I'm having because of my disability are solely because of me, are solely because of like something's wrong with me personally. This has no historical context. There's no reason why people should be acting like this with me, which again, nobody should be experiencing harm or bigotry at all. But what I find was the best thing to go about was learning about the 504 sit-ins, learning about Black Panthers and Brad Lomax and the people that helped the disability rights movement, learning about the perceptions and stereotypes of disability. And no matter what form that takes, utilizing plain language or no, it was such a relief to know that this isn't something that I should be internalizing, but rather I exist within a system of people that are taught to regard me in such a way. And so I think that it was such a relief that it made me feel better. And it also is the reason why I started advocating for myself more often, because this is my legacy as well. This is just as much my legacy um, as it pertains to my Blackness as my disability does. So I think that teaching disability history, teaching what movement work looked like for disabled people, teaching the intersectionality of disability and how many Black people have a disability that we are taught to erase their disabilities of. I think that we need to start having those conversations. And I think that it helps a lot. It helps enormously to know that you're not alone and that you are part of a legacy of Black disabled people or Black people of color, excuse me, or of disabled people of color that come before you.
Yeah, thank you, Mai. That is very helpful. Uh, it's related to something that you shared. One of the participants here today asked like about the idea that you brought up earlier of bigotry being the goal and ableism being the tool, that it was super thought-provoking, and I'd love to dig deeper into that idea. And they asked if you have any resources that you could recommend that they could learn more about this.
Oh, again, Black disability politics goes into how this happened. But if you study, how do I put this? A perfect example is drapetomania. Drapetomania was a diagnosis given to escaped slaves. It was escaped slave syndrome, right? And basically, enslaved peoples who escaped slavery were diagnosed with this illness, right? And it was the recommended treatment for it was hard labor. So oftentimes in our history, what we'll see is the medicalization of um, difference, of marginalization. A good example of this currently happening is in 2022, the state of Tennessee, in order to access gender affirming care, they said in their bill that people who are trans and want to access gender affirming care must also be tested for autism. Right. Which makes no sense if it's just like I'm just trying to get my medical care. Why does it have to do with anything? The reason why is because there's a high incidence of people who are trans and who are autistic. It doesn't mean that people who are autistic are inherently trans, and people who are trans are inherently autistic. It just there's a huge convergence there. But what it means is that once you can medicalize this difference in that way, you could take away the authority that person has on their own life. So they could be more easily thrust into conservatorships or guardianships. They could have their assets taken away from them. They could make it much harder for them to access the care that they want. We also see this again, somebody put in the chat, Trump derangement syndrome, which they're trying to push a bill in Texas to have that designated as a mental illness. We saw in 2023 a woman who was having an affair with a police officer was thrown into a mental facility for reporting that she was in an affair with a married police officer. So this is when we look back on our history, you will see disability in everything from anti-war protests to queer people being castrated to Black people who were experimented on. All these things have roots in eugenics and is as alongside racism as kind of the core and crux to the systems that impact this country. But we oftentimes do not talk about it because we don't like disability. We don't want disability around. We think it's a good thing to quote unquote get rid of disability. The downside of that is that all marginalization leads to disability. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in our own foot.
Imani, thank you so much for being here today.
Uh,
Let's all give Imani a virtual round of applause. Type the number one in the chat, type thank you. Say anything that you want to say to Imani in the chat to send her some love. Imani, let everyone know how they can find you online. Anything that you have coming up that you want to plug in, this is your moment.
sure. So my you can find me on social media at crutches underscore and underscore spice on Instagram and TikTok. And I have a book coming out next year titled If I Were You, I'd Kill Myself, which it's if you talk to a disabled person, you'll understand the title. But I want to thank you all for having me, and I greatly appreciate this conversation you all are um engaging in. It's really needed.
What's the book about? Give us a little bit more context on the tagline there.
So that phrase is something that disabled people hear all the time as like a compliment. People will walk up to me and say, "Oh my God, if I were you, I'd kill myself, but you're so brave." And I'm like, "No." So it's a memoir basically about how ableism has shaped the way I interact with the world.
Love it. Love it. All right. Well, make sure we get the link on that and they can follow you online at Crutches and Spice, right?
Yep, you can find me everywhere.
Love it. Love it. Cool. Well, if you all enjoyed this session, there's more. So we want you all to go ahead and register now for our September 13th session. We'll have another subject matter expert that we will announce soon, but you'll get more of myself, Johnny Bailey, and Banu, who will be here to provide context and moderation for fighting for civil and disability rights, strategies to overcome barriers as we go into part three of the human experience of Black people with disabilities and their rights under the ADA. So you can hit this QR code now. Team, if you all can, please drop a link to the registration page in the chat so folks can register for that right now. We have about 214 people that are still here. Would love for them to get the link today. So many thank yous coming in to Imani, and people are just love, love, love. I love to hear you speak. Thank you for this webinar. So people are definitely filled. Their cup is full for the day. Really glad to hear that. A couple resources. If you all want to get in touch with the ADA, you can contact the national network. I know we have folks here from all over the country, and you can contact them at 1-800-949-4232 or adata.org for the national network. As you can see, the ADA is broken into 10 different regions. We are based in the Mid-Atlantic region, which is the DC, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, Pennsylvania area. Lastly, if you are in this region and you need to get in contact with your local ADA center, please contact 800-949-4232 and you get these. If you're in one of these states, you would access those regions, and also the local phone number is 301-217-0124. I will now wrap it up. We're at time. I want to say thank you to Imani, thank you to Banu, thank you to Anne and Crystal for making this research study possible, for investing your time, your energy into this mission. And I know for a fact that we are moving the ball forward through awareness of the ADA, through seeing people and amplifying the voices that are often go unheard. So we'll see you all September 13th.
No,
And
it's actually, Johnny, it's September 2nd.
oh,
The date
September
was
2nd.
wrong. It's
Thank you for,
September 2nd.
okay, let me just get that right. September 2nd. You'll see that on the registration page. We appreciate you all for showing up. Continue to advocate for yourselves, do your research, and support your people in your community. With that said, thank you all. Have a wonderful week.